The year was 1347, and the air itself felt cursed. The ships came in silent, their sails black with rot, their crews slumped over the rails, eyes open, mouths crawling with flies. You tell yourself it's just another sickness, something that will pass, but it doesn't. Soon the coughing begins wet, ragged, endless. You feel it too, deep in your chest, scraping like nails from the inside. Your head burns, your skin turns cold, and a foul taste fills your mouth. Then come the lumps, black, swollen, bursting beneath your arms, leaking a stench so foul even the rats turn away. The streets are lined with corpses. Mothers clutch their dead children. Priests refuse last rites. Fires burn day and night, but nothing cleanses the air. And as you stumble through the smoke, fevered and trembling, you realize this is no plague, it's hunger. Something ancient is feeding, and now it's inside you. So stay with me, turn down the light, and tell me where you're listening from, what hour, what city. Because this is not just the story of a plague. This is the story of how the air itself turned against mankind, how the Black Death swept through England and the world, not as thunder, but as silence, the kind that follows after the last breath is taken. The year was 1347, and the wind over the Channel carried more than salt. It carried a rumour. In the taverns of Calais and the ports of Gascony, sailors whispered of ships adrift, black-sailed vessels drifting from the east, their decks silent, their ropes creaking like gallows lines in the dusk. Those who went aboard never came back. The harbour masters stopped writing their names in the ledgers. The sea had turned traitor. By autumn, the talk had reached the southern coast of England. It came with merchants and friars, with pilgrims returning from the continent, with sailors who had seen the bodies, sailors who couldn't stop shaking. They spoke of men who coughed up blood until their throats swelled shut, of women whose skin darkened in patches, of children who went to sleep and never woke again. They said it began with a fever, then a swelling, then silence. In the fishing villages of Dorset and the markets of Winchester, people laughed it off at first. There had always been pestilence somewhere, a blight, a miasma, a punishment for sins whispered into the air. The priests said that God had always used disease as his language of correction, and who were they to argue? But the old ones, the ones who remembered the great storms and famines, knew this was something else. They felt it in their bones, in the sudden stillness of the gulls, in the way the sea foam clung to the rocks longer than it should. In a small harbour tavern, a boy wiped down tables as his father traded stories with a passing merchant. Outside, the tide sighed against the shore, bringing in the smell of tar, fish, and something sour beneath it. The faint rot of death hidden beneath the salt. The boy wrinkled his nose, but said nothing. He didn't know that, on a ship anchored not half a mile away, the first black rat had already climbed the mooring rope. Its belly was full, its fleas restless. The night grew cold. Lamps flickered out one by one along the harbour wall. Only the sea moved, black and endless. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a sickness stirred, unseen, unnamed, unstoppable. By the time the first snow fell, the whispers had changed their tone. No longer warnings. Now they were confessions, soft words spoken by men who knew that something vast was coming, and that no prayer, no port, no wall of faith or stone would keep it from crossing the water. The Black Death had not yet arrived in England, but its breath was already in the wind. It was a cold morning when the first ship came into sight, a dark blot against the pale horizon off the southern coast. The fishermen of Southampton were the first to see it, drifting oddly, its sails torn, its flag limp in the wind. No signal, no answer to the harbour bell, just the slow roll of a vessel that seemed neither alive nor abandoned, a shadow rocking with the tide. The dockmaster called for a small crew to meet it. A handful of men rowed out, grumbling at the delay of their day's catch, unaware that they were rowing toward history's most dreadful messenger. As they neared, the smell reached them first, not the scent of salt or tar, but the dense, sweet odour of rot beneath canvas. One of the men gagged and turned away. Another swore it was just spoiled cargo. But when they climbed aboard, the truth rose up to meet them. The deck was silent except for the slow sway of the ropes. A cat darted between the barrels, its fur patchy and its eyes wild. The crew lay, scattered like broken dolls, faces grey, lips cracked, skin marked by swollen knots the size of eggs. Some had died clutching their throats. Others had torn their own shirts in a final gasping attempt to breathe. The rats were everywhere, darting through the rigging, their black bodies sleek with sickness. The captain's log was open in the cabin. Its last entry was written in a trembling hand: Messina, Sicily, God forgive us. The men are dying faster than we can bury them. We sail north. The ink had bled into the paper, the words fading as if the disease had reached even the page. By the time the dockhands towed the vessel into port, the onlookers had gathered curious merchants, wives clutching baskets, children pointing at the strange drifting ship. None knew that with every gust of wind, invisible passengers leapt from rat to man. Within hours, one of the dock workers complained of chills. By nightfall, he was vomiting blood in his bed, his wife weeping beside him, her prayers muffled by fear. The priests came quickly, crossing themselves as they boarded the vessel. They sprinkled holy water and sang psalms, though the words trembled in their throats. One of them, a young friar with kind eyes, tried to bless the dead. When he turned the captain's body over, something black spilled from the man's mouth, a clot of blood and foam. The friar screamed, stumbled back, and fell hard against the railing. The next morning, the ship was empty again. The priests had left, the dockhands refused to return, and the townsfolk kept their distance. The vessel sat alone in the water, gently knocking against the quay as if trying to speak. 3 days later, the first funerals began. No one yet said the word plague. They called it a fever, a misfortune, a sailor's curse. But in every corner of the town, rats scurried beneath floorboards, unseen and unstoppable. And beyond the harbour, more ships were coming from Bordeaux, from Gascony, from Bruges, each carrying the same silence, the same black breath of death, drifting softly toward the English shore. By the time the sun rose over Winchester, the sickness had a price. It was carried not in the air alone, but in the folds of cloth, the grain sacks, the barrels of wine, and the wool packed tight aboard merchant carts bound for the heart of England. Men who dealt in trade were not easily frightened. To them, rumour was just wind, something that filled sails, not coffins. So when a shipmaster from Southampton offered his wares at half their worth, the buyers did not ask why. In the market square, the day smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. A trader named Thomas Everley, known for his steady hand with a bargain, took delivery of several bales of cloth that had come off the docks only 2 days before. The bolts were fine, soft, foreign, expensive, even when cheap, and though the dockhands muttered about the sailors who died aboard the ship, Thomas only crossed himself, muttering that death was the sea's own business. By dusk, his cart was heavy with goods, his pockets heavier, with pride. He did not notice the small movement inside the bale, the scratching, the faint hiss of something alive. That night, Thomas reached his home on the outskirts of Winchester, where his wife waited with supper already cooling on the table. Their youngest daughter, a quiet child with hair like straw, played by the hearth with a wooden doll. Thomas smiled as he set down the cloth, brushing the rain from his sleeves. In another room, something soft thumped against the floorboards, the sound of a rat landing lightly, sniffing the warm air. By morning, the first fever had begun. His apprentice, a boy of 15, complained of dizziness. His cheeks flushed, then paled, then darkened beneath the skin. When Thomas sent for the physician, the man refused to come, saying he had too many sick to tend already. So Thomas's wife dampened a cloth with vinegar and laid it across the boy's brow, whispering prayers as the child gasped for breath. By the time the sun touched the hills, he was gone. They buried him behind the stable, quietly, with no priest. Thomas burned the bedding, the tools, the boy's clothes, everything but the cloth he'd bought. That, he told himself, could still be sold. The sickness had touched the boy, not the wool. 2 days later, Thomas's wife began to cough. Soon the house was locked from the inside. Smoke rose from the chimney as the neighbors whispered through the hedgerows. The shutters stayed closed even at noon. When no one saw Thomas at market, they crossed themselves and said it was God's will. By week's end, the cart still sat in the yard, loaded with the same bolts of cloth, the same that would, in days to come, find their way into other hands, other towns, and other homes. No one knew it yet, but that bargain had set the plague upon its path inland. Through trade, through touch, through the soft breath of sleeping children. What Thomas carried into Winchester that week was not profit. It was England's undoing, wrapped neatly in wool. At first, it was the smell that changed, not the sharp bite of winter hearths or the damp rot of thatched roofs after rain, but something sweeter, a sickly perfume that hung in the streets like invisible fog. It came from the south, people said, from the ports, from the traders, from the warehouses that still held the cloth and grain unloaded from ships whose names no one dared to repeat. It was faint at first, almost pleasant, like honey left too long in the sun. But beneath it lay something wrong, something the body recognized before the mind did. In Winchester, the apothecaries began to boil vinegar in copper pots, waving branches of rosemary through the air as if they could cleanse it. Housewives hung lavender over their doors, rubbed salt on their windowsills, and burned old boots in their hearths. Anything to drown the scent that seemed to linger even after the smoke had gone. The priests said the air was poisoned by sin. The physicians said it was corrupted by the priest, alignment of the planets. But no one could name it, and so everyone feared it. By midwinter, the sickness had a rhythm. It came quietly at night, a cough, a fever, a whisper of prayer, and by morning, another body wrapped in cloth. Those who could fled to the countryside, believing the open air safer than the crowded streets. But the fields were no refuge. The same smell followed them there, threading through the frost, seeping through barn doors and into dreams. In the city, the markets grew thin. Butchers sold salted meat instead of fresh. Bakers stood behind empty stalls, their aprons clean because there was no one left to bake for. The bell of street. Swithins tolled so often that the ropes frayed, and when they snapped, the priests began striking the bell with hammers instead. Each toll was softer now, but no less heavy. At night, dogs roamed the lanes, barking at doors that no longer opened. The watchmen lit torches at every corner, their flames trembling in the damp. They were told to burn anything that smelled too strong: clothes, furniture, even letters. A boy was beaten for bringing flowers to his mother's window. "The scent carries death," someone shouted. He ran until his small figure vanished into the smoke. On the 3rd week of January, frost covered the town like glass. The rivers froze, but the smell did not fade. It grew thicker, as if the cold itself could not stop it. Behind every shuttered home, a candle burned low beside the sick. Some still prayed aloud, their words thin and wavering, the syllables of Latin spilling like cracked ice. Others sat in silence, listening for the sound of the next cough. And through it all, the air remained deceptively gentle, soft, perfumed, almost sweet. It carried no sound of thunder, no scream, no warning, only that strange sweetness that crept into every breath, marking the difference between the living and the soon-to-be dead. England still thought it could outlast the fever, but the plague had already settled into its lungs. The sweetness in the air was not mercy, it was decay learning to sing. It began in a cottage outside Winchester, a small, timber-framed house with a single window that faced the river. Inside, a young mother named Agnes knelt by the fire, stirring a pot of broth for her husband, who had been too weak to stand since dawn. His name was Will, a mason by trade, strong-shouldered once, but now trembling as if winter had entered his bones. He had come home from the market pale, muttering that the air had turned heavy, that his skin itched beneath his shirt. By nightfall, his forehead burned like coal. Agnes dipped a cloth in the cool water pail and laid it across his brow. His eyes rolled back, his breath rattling. When she lifted his tunic, she saw the swelling dark knots under the arms and along the groin, hard as stones and tender as bruises. She gasped and crossed herself, whispering the Lord's Prayer, though the words came out broken. Will tried to speak, but only blood filled his mouth, bubbling at the corners. By morning, the cottage smelled of vinegar and sweat. The little ones hid behind the bed, clutching one another as their father's body jerked in fever. Agnes sent her eldest to fetch the priest, but when he reached the churchyard, the doors were locked. The parish bell had rung at sunrise, not for mass, but for morning. There were no priests left to call upon. So she did what others had begun to do. She nailed shut the door from the inside and waited. The air was still, the fire low, and Will's breathing shallowed with each hour. When his chest finally stopped rising, Agnes pressed her hand to his heart and waited for the next beat. None came. She did not cry. She simply sat, her eyes glassy and unfocused, until dusk bled through the window. Outside, a cart passed slowly down the lane, its wheels crunching the frozen mud. A voice called out through the evening mist, "Bring out your dead!" The words echoed like thunder, fading into the sound of creaking axles and hooves. Agnes did not answer. She lifted her husband's arm, kissed his knuckles once, then pulled the blanket over his face. Through the night, she tended to the children. Though the youngest had begun to cough, the fever was quick. A whisper of heat, a bloom of black spots beneath the skin. By dawn, 2 more lay still beside their father. Agnes dragged the bodies to the door, her strength spent, her voice gone to hoarseness. When the cart returned, she opened it and stepped aside, her hair undone, her eyes hollow. The men lifted the bodies without a word. One of them looked at her and said quietly, "You should come too." But she shook her head. "Not yet," she whispered. When they left, she shut the door again, though she no longer bothered with the nails. The smell of the broth still lingered, faint, sour, mixed with something else now. She sat beside the fire until it burned itself out, the silence broken only by her own shallow breath. That night, in the stillness, she felt the first tremor beneath her skin. A fever blooming like a seed. The plague had found her, as it would find them all. By morning, her cottage was quiet, one more light gone dark on the map of England. By February, the bells had forgotten what silence sounded like. From the cathedral towers of Salisbury, their iron throats rang through the mist, hour after hour, day after day, until the ropes wore smooth as river stones from the strain. They tolled for merchants, for mothers, for children whose names no one had time to write down. They tolled until the verger's palms bled, until the air itself trembled with the weight of mourning. The city beneath them moved like a fever dream. Streets that had once echoed with merchants' cries were lined now with carts covered by linen, their drivers whispering prayers as they rolled toward the burial pits beyond the walls. At dawn, smoke curled from pyres beside the Avon, where the dead were burned not for holiness, but for haste. The frost could not harden the ground quickly enough for the shovels to keep pace. The clergy tried to keep order. Processions moved through the streets, priests carrying relics, chanting in trembling voices that vanished into the winter fog. But even they could not escape what followed them. One by one, the canons of the cathedral fell ill, their vestments stained dark with sweat, their lips cracked from fever. The bishop himself ordered that no service be held indoors. "God," he said, "will hear us in the open air, or not at all." And so they prayed in the churchyard, hundreds gathered together beneath a colorless sky. The faithful knelt in the frozen grass, breath rising in pale clouds, listening to the wind carry their psalms away. When the bishop raised the host for communion, his hand trembled so badly that the bread broke in two. The crowd took it as a sign, though none agreed on what it meant. Inside the city walls, fear became its own contagion. Mothers left their sick children behind locked doors. Neighbors turned away from one another in the lanes. The grave diggers drank to dull the sight of what they carried each day, infants bundled in shawls, old men stiff as timber, Entire families laid out as if asleep. When wine ran out, they drank the holy water. By March, the sound of the bells no longer marked individual deaths. They rang continuously now, a single, endless lament that rolled over the countryside. Travelers on the road to Winchester said you could hear it for miles, a deep, aching hum that made the horses shiver and the riders cross themselves. "Salisbury is dying," they whispered, "and London will be next." On the night of the equinox, the great bell cracked. The tone splintered mid-peal, echoing through the dark like the breaking of a bone. The verger, too weak to climb the steps, sat at the base of the tower with his back against the stone, his hands shaking around the frayed rope. In the morning, no one came to ring it again. The ropes hung limp in the cold air, swaying with the breeze. The people had grown used to the sound, and now, in its absence, the silence felt wrong, almost unbearable. The bell tower stood above a city of ghosts. Smoke rose from chimneys where no one cooked. Windows glowed with candlelight beside empty chairs, and far below, in the cathedral crypt, the last monk of Salisbury whispered his final prayer, not for mercy, but for quiet, a quiet that never came. By the time the frost began to melt, death had learned to crawl. It came on small feet, silent and black, whiskers trembling as it slipped between cracks in doors and under shutters nailed tight. The people still blamed the stars, the sinners, the foreign traders, anything but the soft, hungry eyes that watched them from the shadows. Rats had always lived among them, but never like this. Never so many, never so bold. In the village of Amesbury, a miller's wife named Joan sat beside her hearth, spinning wool by the glow of a single candle. Her youngest boy had taken ill the night before, a heat in his chest, a red flush across his neck, and now she waited for his breathing to steady. The candle burned low. The house was still. Then came the sound of faint scratching, a quick scurry across the floorboards. She turned her head toward it, half expecting the cat. But the cat was gone. It had not returned in days. Beneath the table, something moved. A black shape darted through the straw, pausing near her foot. Its eyes caught the candlelight, bright, feverish, almost human. She hissed and kicked at it, but the creature only bolted toward the cradle where the boy lay sleeping. In one motion, she seized the broom and swung. The rat vanished into the shadows, leaving only a soft squeak behind. Joan knelt by the cradle, whispering to the child, her hands trembling. She did not see the fleas leaping from the straw to her skirt, nor feel their bite. By dawn, her fever began. The villagers were used to pestilence by now, or thought they were. They sealed their homes, burned bundles of sage, scrubbed their floors with lye. But nothing kept the rats away. They came in lines like armies, pouring from the grain stores, the gutters, the broken mill by the river. Men who had once laughed at superstition now beat drums at night, believing the sound would drive the creatures off. The noise only seemed to draw them closer. At the monastery beyond the fields, the brothers kept records of the deaths. Each morning they counted bodies, then wiped their hands with vinegar before eating. One of them, Brother Matthew, began sketching the animals in the margins of his ledger, long tails, sharp teeth, eyes like embers. "They are the devil's mouths," he wrote in careful Latin, "and the fleas his breath." Within a week, Brother Matthew himself was dead, his quill still in hand. No one spoke of the rats anymore. To name them was to invite them. Children learned to sleep with blankets over their heads, and mothers laid traps they never checked. When the scratching came at night, they simply closed their eyes and prayed it would pass their door. In the corners of every cottage, the creatures grew fat on crumbs and corpses alike. They moved like smoke, unseen until it was too late. The people feared God, feared death, feared the air itself, but not the sound beneath their tables. By spring, the rats had reached London, and with them came the silence that followed every cough. The plague had found its true heralds, and they needed no language to announce its coming, only teeth and time. By the spring of 1348, London felt wrong. The city that had once thundered with trade and laughter had grown hushed, its streets heavy with the weight of rumor. The Thames, usually alive with barges and shouts, drifted with the tide in eerie silence. Markets opened late and closed early. The scent of roasted meat and beer had been replaced by something metallic, faint but unmistakable, the smell of sickness in the air. At first, people blamed the South. The sickness was a seafaring thing, they said, a foreign malady carried by traders from France or sailors from the Italian coast. But the docks of Southwark told another story. Piles of wool sat untouched beneath canvas. The dockhands whispered that too many rats scurried among the ropes, and the cats, once lazy and fat, had all disappeared. Even the gulls had grown thin. The physicians, proud in their long dark robes, walked the streets carrying pomanders of spice and vinegar pressed to their faces. They prescribed purges and bloodletting, prayers and powders of crushed emeralds, remedies as costly as they were useless. A merchant could spend a fortune on hope in those days and still be dead by morning. The poorer districts, Street Giles, Cripplegate, Whitechapel, suffered first. Narrow lanes where the air barely moved, where 10 souls might share one bed, became death traps. The City Watch ordered the sick confined to their homes. The orders came too late. Every morning, doors that had been nailed shut the night before were silent. Behind them, only bodies. By May, the carts began to roll. Rough men with scarves tied across their faces went street to street, knocking on doors with iron hooks. "Bring out your dead!" they shouted, though the phrase was already losing its meaning. Some households brought 3, some 7, some none, because there was no one left to bring them. The corpses were carried to open fields outside the city walls, where trenches had been dug deep, as wells. They buried them in layers, one row of bodies, then a thin scattering of earth, then another. The ground rose higher each week, the smell drifting back toward the city with the wind. The great churches tried to keep their rights. At St. Paul's, the bells tolled until the ringers collapsed from exhaustion. The bishop spoke of penance, but even he could not find the words to explain what was happening. God's hand, he called it finally. But if it was the hand of God, it was one that spared no one, not clergy, not noble, not beggar. And then came the quiet. People stopped ringing bells for the dead. They stopped praying aloud. The sound of feet in the lanes faded until the city seemed to listen to itself. The hush of the river, the whisper of wind through alleys, the distant caw of a crow on a rooftop. London was still alive, but only just. Those who remained moved like ghosts, clutching herbs to their noses, avoiding one another's gaze. Even laughter had become suspect, as though joy itself might summon the plague. That summer, the city did what no army could make it do. It stopped breathing. From the docks to the palace, from the taverns to the monasteries, London held its breath, waiting to see who would breathe again. The first sound was barely more than a whisper, a dry, rasping cough that echoed once beneath the vaulted arches of St. Paul's and was quickly swallowed by the chant of the choir. The monks continued their hymn, eyes lifted toward the ribs of the great ceiling, the air thick with incense and candle smoke. No one looked to see where the sound had come from. There were coughs everywhere that spring, coughs in the markets, in the guild halls, in the taverns by the river. The city itself seemed to be clearing its throat, trying to speak through fever, but by vespers, another cough followed, wetter this time, deep and strained, breaking through the harmony of voices. The chanting faltered. One of the younger novices clutched his chest, his face pale beneath the flickering light. A brother beside him steadied his arm, but when the boy opened his mouth, a mist of blood spattered the hymn book. The music died instantly. The head cantor ordered the choir dismissed, but the air had already changed. The scent of myrrh and beeswax could no longer hide the underlying rot. The congregation fled into the courtyard, crossing themselves in silence. The boy was carried to the infirmary on the south side of the cathedral, where 2 monks burned sprigs of juniper and muttered prayers. They called it a fever of the lungs. But by nightfall, 3 others had taken ill, the cantor, the scribe, and the physician himself. By the next morning, The cathedral bell rang not for worship but for death. The sound drifted across the city, mingling with the cries of the dead carts. The Bishop of London ordered the nave closed for purification. Smoke rose from censers for 3 days and nights, but the sickness lingered, invisible, patient, waiting. On the 4th day, a funeral procession entered through the north gate, a merchant's family, father, mother, 2 sons carried in by porters. The priests refused to touch the bodies, performing the rites from a distance. The bishop sprinkled holy water with a trembling hand. When he turned to leave, his face was the color of parchment. The congregation saw him cough once into his sleeve. Soon the cathedral itself became a tomb. Candles burned down to stubs, their wax pooling on the flagstones. Mice scurried between pews. The altar cloths, once spotless and gold-threaded, were stained with smoke and ash. The choir stalls stood empty. Only the pigeons remained, nesting in the rafters, their wings whispering above the silence like pages turning in an invisible book. A week later, a stranger entered, a beggar woman, barefoot, her hair tangled, carrying the body of her child. She laid him at the foot of the altar, whispering, "He was good, Lord, he was good." Her voice echoed up into the dome and faded. No answer came. That night, lightning struck the cathedral's spire. The townsfolk took it as a sign not of wrath, but of abandonment. They said the heavens themselves were closing their doors. By dawn, the smoke still curled above the city, and St. Paul's stood dark, its doors chained shut. Within its walls, the pews were lined with the dead, their faces turned toward the vaulted ceiling, as though still waiting for a sermon that would never come. It began as a single cart, creaking through the cobbled lanes of Southwark, its wheels thick with mud and ash. The driver was a broad man named Ham, a carter who once hauled timber from the docks. Now he carried a different cargo. His horse, ribs showing through its hide, pulled the cart slowly as the man called out into the still air, "Bring out your dead." The sound rolled between the houses like thunder swallowed by fog. At first, few answered. Doors cracked open just enough for eyes to peer out. A woman stepped forward with a bundle in her arms not much larger than a loaf of bread. Her face was grey, her hands shaking as she laid the small shape onto the cart without a word. Ham nodded, crossed himself, and covered it with a piece of sacking. He had seen worse, though not much. By midday there were 5 bodies. By dusk there were 20. They were stacked carefully at first, limbs tucked in, heads turned away from the wheel spokes, but as the sun bled over the rooftops, care turned to exhaustion. The cart filled until the dead lay tangled together, a mass of linen and silence. The carts multiplied. From Cheapside to Bishopsgate, from Southwark to Whitechapel, they rolled on through the streets. Each had a driver, each had a bell or a shout, each had a horse that looked too tired to move. The air shook with the sound of wooden wheels, the dull thud of bodies being laid down, the muttering of prayers half remembered. Some tried to pay to have their dead buried separately, a coin placed in the carter's hand, for a name scratched onto a wooden board, for a promise that their loved one would not be thrown into the pit with strangers. But promises meant little now. By the time the carts reached the fields outside the city walls, the gravediggers had stopped counting. They worked by torchlight, faces wrapped in cloth, soaked with vinegar. The trenches were deep and wide, dug through frozen earth until the shovels bent from use. The smell rose, heavy and sweet. Some men vomited, some wept, others simply stared. They dropped the bodies in layers, one, then dirt, then another, then dirt again until the trench filled and the ground swelled like bread left too long to rise. Ham stopped eating. The food turned to ash in his mouth. He slept by his cart, unwilling to go home, though he no longer remembered where that was. The sound of the wheels haunted him even in dreams, even when he tried to remember what silence used to feel like. On the 3rd week, his horse collapsed mid-route. He left it where it fell and dragged the cart himself. The wood groaned, the wheels squealed, and still he called, voice hoarse, "Bring out your dead." By then, the city no longer needed calling. The dead were everywhere, in alleys, on doorsteps, leaning against walls as if resting. The carts rolled until the ground was too full to hold them. When Ham's cart was finally found abandoned by the roadside, the reins trailing in the mud, no one touched it. The wind blew through the empty harness, making the faint sound of a bell, and in the hush that followed, London realized something terrible: the dead no longer needed collecting. They had already taken the city for their own. On the corner of Fleet Street stood a narrow shop, whose windows once gleamed with jars of colour, crimson elixirs, green tonics, blue glass bottles stoppered with wax. For 30 years, Master Edmund Holt had kept it open. He had treated fevers and headaches, gout and childbirth, the ordinary afflictions of an ordinary city. But now, when he pulled back the shutters at dawn, the street outside lay empty. No laughter from the fishmongers, no footsteps on the cobbles, only fog pressed against the glass, as if the world itself had stopped to listen. Inside, the shelves sagged under the weight of hope. Dried herbs from Kent Angelica, fennel, wormwood, all once trusted to drive away sickness. Tiny packets of mercury powder, once sold for pennies to treat the bad humours. But there was no cure for this. His hands, once steady enough to measure a dram by sight alone, trembled as he poured vinegar over copper coins to cleanse them. He still took payment habit more than greed, but by the time he reached for the jar, most of his customers were already too weak to stand. A woman came one morning with her daughter, a girl barely 12. "She burns," the mother whispered. Edmund looked at the child's neck. Beneath the skin, a swelling rose like a buried apple, purple at the edges. He mixed vinegar with rose oil, soaked a cloth, and pressed it gently against her throat. The girl whimpered. The mother crossed herself. "It will ease her," he lied. By nightfall, the pair were gone, leaving only the handkerchief, stained with blood and perfume. Each day, more came the desperate, the grieving, the ones who still believed that medicine might outwit death. Edmund spoke softly to them, measuring powders, grinding roots, reciting Latin prayers that had long since lost their meaning. He wore a mask soaked in herbs, the scent of thyme and cloves sharp in his nose. It helped nothing, but it gave him courage. On the 5th day of May he heard shouting from the square. A crowd had gathered before another apothecary's door, smashing bottles, accusing him of brewing the pest. The man's wife screamed as they dragged him into the street. "You fed us poison!" someone cried. They beat him until he stopped moving. Edmund closed his shutters, the glass rattling under his hands. That night, he did not light his candle. When he woke, the air inside his shop was heavy, sour, unmoving. The herbs hung limp from their strings. The mortar lay cracked on the counter. He stood for a long time before the window, watching the fog thicken until he could no longer see the street. Then he picked up his quill and wrote a single line in his ledger. "There is no cure for the breath itself." That evening, a watchman passing by saw the window still lit. He knocked, but no one answered. Through the glass, he could just make out the apothecary's shape, head bowed, hands folded, still behind his counter. The bottles gleamed faintly in the candlelight, their colours untouched, their contents waiting. By morning the door was sealed with wax. No one entered again. The shop stood silent for months, its jars fading to dust behind the window, a museum of good intentions, of knowledge defeated by something far older, far quieter, and far more patient than any man's craft. In a monastery overlooking the Thames, Brother Anselm bent over his desk as the morning light crept through the narrow windows, turning the dust in the air to gold. The chill clung to his fingers, but still he wrote, line after careful line, his quill scratching the parchment like a restless insect. Outside, the sound of bells drifted faintly from London, distant, constant, mournful. It was the only sound left that marked the passing of time. He was one of the last scribes left alive. The others had fallen, one by one. Brother John in his sleep, Brother Matthew with his face upon his psalter, the ink still wet beneath his hand. The abbot had ordered the scriptorium sealed, but Anselm refused to stop. If we do not write, he said, "then even God will forget what we were." And so he kept his vigil with parchment and ink, chronicling the dead as faithfully as he once copied the words of saints. He recorded the names as they came to him: peasants, merchants, knights, children, midwives, sailors. Sometimes he only had a first name, sometimes none. He would write an unknown woman, a child from Southwark, a man from the river. The list grew longer each day until it filled volumes. His handwriting grew smaller and more hurried, as if he could outrun the sickness with words. At night, when the ink froze in its pot and his lamp guttered low, Anselm would look through the high window toward the city. He could see the faint glow of fires in the distance, pyres where the dead were burned because the ground could hold no more. The smoke rose straight into the heavens, black against the stars. "Deliver them, Lord," he whispered, but his voice sounded strange in the hollow room, swallowed by the cold. On the 10th day of his vigil, his ink began to thicken. He scraped the bottom of the pot, but it clung stubbornly to the sides. He mixed what little wine he had left into the pigment, diluting it until the words bled pale across the page. His hand shook with hunger and fatigue. Each letter looked weaker than the last. When Brother Thomas came to check on him, he found the door barred from the inside. "Anselm," he called softly, "you must eat, you must rest." There was no answer, only the soft rhythm of quill on parchment. He tried again later, and this time the sound had stopped. They broke down the door at dawn. The parchment on the desk was covered edge to edge, with writing no margins, no spaces, only names upon names upon names, until the ink trailed off midline. The final entry was barely legible, and the Lord saw them all. Brother Anselm lay slumped forward, his fingers still curved around the quill. The pot beside him was dry, the last drop of ink hardened to black glass. The abbot ordered the room left, as it was. No one had the heart to touch it. Years later, when the plague had passed, travelers came upon the monastery in ruins. Among the rubble, they found the scriptorium desk still standing, the parchment untouched by rot, the writing still visible in its faded hand. The ink might have run dry, but the words remained a record of a world gasping for remembrance while the air itself conspired to erase it. On the outskirts of Norwich stood a timbered house with blue shutters, faded from years of rain and salt wind. Once it had been full of life, laughter spilling into the street, the smell of bread baking in the oven, children chasing one another through the yard. But now the shutters were nailed closed, the door barred from the inside, and no smoke rose from the chimney. To the neighbours, it looked as if the house itself had stopped breathing. Inside, Margaret Hale knelt at the foot of her bed, whispering a prayer she no longer believed would be heard. Her husband, a cooper, had fallen ill 5 days earlier. It had begun with a soreness in his neck, then a fever, then swelling that bloomed under his arms like dark fruit. By the second night, he could not speak. By the third, he had stopped moving altogether. She kept him covered in the wool blanket he had once brought home from market, though the smell of sickness had begun to seep through the cloth. The neighbours had told her to stay inside. "Seal the windows," they said. "If the air gets in, it'll take you too." So she hammered the shutters closed and stuffed the cracks with rags soaked in vinegar. The house grew dim, then dark. The only light came from the hearth, where the fire burned low and sour, fed by broken furniture and scraps of old cloth. Her children, Alice, 7, and Hugh, 5, lay side by side on the floor. They no longer played. They no longer spoke. Margaret could hear their shallow breathing as she moved through the rooms, counting each exhale as though it might be the last. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers outside, voices calling, footsteps in the lane, but when she pressed her ear to the wall, there was nothing. Only wind, and the faint scurrying of rats in the rafters. On the 5th night, Hugh began to cough. It was soft at first, like clearing his throat, but by dawn it had deepened into something wet and hollow. Margaret held him close, rocking him as he shivered. Alice sat beside them, silent, watching the fire. The house felt smaller with each breath. the air thick and sour. The vinegar cloths had gone dry. She did not dare open a window. When Hugh stopped breathing, she did not scream. She simply laid him next to his father, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Alice took her hand and whispered, "Will we go to church soon, Mama?" Margaret nodded. "Soon," she said. By the end of the week, the house was silent. The neighbors, who had long since stopped checking on one another, noticed nothing but the stillness, no movement, no light, no sound of the latch turning at dawn. When the constable finally forced open the door, the air that spilled out was thick and foul, heavy with the scent of vinegar and death. He found them together, mother and daughter on the floor, father and son beside the bed as if they had simply fallen asleep. The shutters, nailed shut from within, had kept the sickness from leaving, but it also kept the living from escaping. For days afterward, the townsfolk avoided that street. The blue-shuttered house stood dark and untouched, its boards creaking softly in the wind. At night, they said, it sounded almost like breathing the faint inhale and exhale of a house that had once been full of life, now sealed against the world it could no longer bear to face. By midsummer, the song of the fields was gone. The whir of scythes, the call of the herdsman, the bark of dogs, all had faded, replaced by a strange, unbroken quiet that stretched from the hedgerows of Kent to the meadows of Yorkshire. The wheat stood tall and golden, heavy with grain, but there were no hands left to harvest it. The wind moved through the stalks like breath through the lungs of a dying man, soft, irregular, fading. In the village of Wilton, where the Avon curved through the lowlands, the earth had begun to reclaim what was once tended. Cattle wandered loose, their bells muffled by tall grass. The mill stood still, its wheel locked in place by weeds. The smell of hay had turned sweet and sour at once, the scent of plenty left to rot. The few who remained walked the fields in silence, their faces hollow, their eyes wary, as though the land itself had become haunted. Thomas Beck, once the reeve of the manor, rose before dawn each day out of habit, though there was no one left to direct. He moved through the empty barns, touching the grain sacks as if to reassure himself they were still there. His lord had fled months earlier, riding north with his household in the night. The last letter he sent spoke of safety in the high country, but rumour said his estate had fallen too. The plague spared no rank. Thomas's wife, Agnes, had died in May, his 2 sons followed by June. Now he lived on bread hardened to stone and water drawn from the same well where the washerwomen once gossiped and sang. He could not bear to fill it in, though he no longer drank without boiling it first. The water had grown a bitter taste like metal or memory. Across the fields, smoke rose in thin lines from distant pyres. The villagers had stopped burying their dead when the ground grew too full, when the grave-diggers began to die before their work was done. The bodies were left in barns, in ditches, in the shade of hedgerows. Sometimes, in the evenings, Thomas thought, he saw shapes moving there, shadows shifting against the horizon. He told himself they were only foxes. One morning, a girl appeared at the edge of the field, barefoot, her dress torn, her face grey with dust. She carried a loaf wrapped in cloth and asked if she might rest. Thomas led her to the barn, where they sat together in the straw. She said she had walked from Salisbury, that her whole family was gone. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she broke the bread. When the sun set, he offered her a place by the fire. By dawn, she was dead. The loaf lay untouched beside her, her head resting against the wall as if in sleep. Thomas did not move her right away. He sat beside her for hours, listening to the wind sweep through the fields. It sounded almost like the old days, the sigh of wheat, the hum of bees, the whisper of scythes, but the sound was only memory, echoing in a world that no longer answered. By autumn, the fields stood black with rain. The grain sprouted, wild and uneven, falling before it could be cut. The land, once England's proud heart, had gone still, and in that stillness, something ancient returned, the silence of a world left untended, patient and indifferent, waiting for men to come back to it, or not at all. The manor at Hatherley had once been the pride of Devon. its oak-beamed roof rising above the valley, its stables full, its hearths burning day and night. From the road below, travellers could see the banners fluttering at the gatehouse and hear the sound of laughter drifting from the great hall. But by the summer of 1349, the flags had faded to rags, the fires had gone out, and the only sound left in the courtyard was the cawing of crows. Sir Geoffrey of Hatherley had fled at the first sign of sickness. He had taken his wife, his sons, and what servants were still well enough to travel, retreating to a hunting lodge in the high moors where the air was said to be pure. The rest were left behind, the cooks, the stable boys, the maid who scrubbed the floors, the reeve who kept the books. Before he left, Geoffrey had given orders to lock the gates and admit no one from outside. "If the plague comes," he said, "it will find no welcome here." But the plague did not need to be welcomed. It was already waiting inside. The cook, old Martha, fell first, a fever that burned so fiercely she cracked her teeth, clenching against it. Then the reeve, who collapsed over the accounts, his ink mixing with the blood from his nose. Within a fortnight, the hall was silent except for the whisper of flies. The remaining servants gathered the dead and laid them in the chapel, but when the last of them fell ill, the burial bell never rang. Weeks passed. The gates stood locked, the courtyard still. In the stables, horses broke free of their stalls, trampling through the gardens in search of water. The peacocks that had once strutted across the lawn wandered into the woods, their feathers dull beneath the rain. Rats nested in the cupboards, the grain stores, the bedchambers where silks hung untouched. In late August, a band of travellers came upon the manor while seeking shelter. They found the outer gate ajar and the path overgrown with nettles. Inside, they moved cautiously, calling out into the silence. The air smelled of mildew and candle wax, of something older beneath it. In the great hall, the long table still stood, plates set as if a feast had been interrupted, bread hardened to stone, goblets half full of wine gone to vinegar. A single chair had been overturned. When one of the men reached for a candle, his sleeve brushed a tapestry, sending a cloud of dust into the air. In the dim light, they saw the figure sitting at the head of the table, a man in fine clothes, his hands folded neatly, his skin grey as parchment. Around his neck hung a golden chain. The travellers stared, realizing with horror who he was. Sir Geoffrey had never made it to the moors. He had come home to die. They left before nightfall, taking nothing. By dawn, fog covered the manor again, and the valley below lay still. The house that had once echoed with song now held only silence. The portraits on the walls stared out into the dark, their painted eyes dulled with dust. And so the hall stood, doorless and hollow, its hearth long cold, a monument to a vanished order. For centuries it would remain that way, a shell of stone and timber, its lord and servants equal at last beneath the same collapsing roof, their names forgotten but their silence eternal. By the autumn of 1349, a new symbol haunted England's towns, a rough black cross smeared in pitch or ash upon a door. It marked not faith, but surrender. The order had come first from the city bailiffs of London, who could no longer count the dead and needed some way to warn the living. Any house where the sickness had struck was to be sealed, the family kept inside until all within were gone. Over time, the mark became a prayer and a curse, in one Lord have mercy upon us. In the narrow lanes of York, whole rows of houses bore the sign. The air was thick with the smell of tar, and beneath it, the heavier odour of decay. A widow named Eleanor stood outside her neighbour's cottage one morning, watching as two men from the guild brushed the door with black paint. She knew what it meant. She had helped care for the family only days before. The father had been coughing blood when she brought them bread. The mother had been too weak to lift her child. Now the house was silent, and the men worked quickly, turning its threshold into a boundary between the world of the living and the condemned. When they left, Eleanor lingered. She traced the rough edges of the mark with her finger and whispered, "It's only a door." But even as she said it, she felt the truth. The cross was not just on the wood, it was upon the whole street, upon every heart that still dared to beat. Inside the sealed homes, time slowed. The sick lay in darkened rooms, listening to the faint footsteps outside, hoping to hear the sound of mercy. But none came. The watchmen carried long poles with hooks to push bread and water through the upper windows, shouting for the occupants to stay back. At night, the dogs howled, smelling what men could no longer bear to see. In Norwich, a clerk recorded the number of marked houses each morning. At first, he wrote them carefully. 7 in street, Andrews 9 in the close, 12 in the lanes beyond the wall. By the 4th week, he stopped counting. His ink began to run with tears and shaking hands. The ledger ended midline. The black cross soon appeared in villages too. In small parishes where no law reached, it was painted by trembling neighbors, or by the doomed themselves. Some drew it in ash, some carved it with a knife. In one hamlet near Lincoln, a farmer marked his own door before lying down beside his wife. He wanted the world to know they had not fled, that they had faced the sickness together. Children learned to avoid the sight, walking in the middle of the road and holding sprigs of rosemary to their faces. To see a house with a cross was to glimpse death's waiting room, a place where the air no longer moved, where prayers curdled into whispers. By the year's end, there were streets in England where every door bore the same dark sign, as though the plague had written its own scripture upon the wood. When winter came, snow dusted the rooftops white, but the crosses showed through black, against the frost, unmelting. And those who still walked the streets learned not to look too closely, for in that mark they saw not only the fate of others, but the promise of their own. In a cottage outside Ely, where the marsh reeds swayed like ghosts in the mist, a woman named Isolde tended the sick. She was no physician. The city doctors had fled long ago, but she knew herbs, and she knew mercy. The people called her the widow with the healer's hands, though her touch brought as much comfort to the dying as to the living. She had buried her husband the previous winter, a fever that took him before the frost thawed. When the plague came, she did not run. She filled her baskets with thyme, yarrow, sage, and vinegar-soaked rags, and walked into the silence that others avoided. Her first patients were neighbors, a farmer's wife, and her 2 sons, their faces flushed with fever. She sat by their bedside, washing their skin with vinegar, whispering prayers under her breath. "Breathe slowly," she told them, though she knew it would not save them. When they died 3 days later, she closed their eyes herself and lit a candle in the window. Then she turned to the next house, and the next. Word spread. People began leaving bundles at her door, bread, coins, sometimes only a thank you written in a trembling hand. She rarely slept. Her small home became a place of passage, where the dying came to be tended, and the living came to pretend for a little while that kindness still existed. She burned herbs on the hearth to purify the air, her eyes watering in the smoke. One evening, a mother brought her a child wrapped in a wool cloak. The boy's breathing rattled like dry leaves. "Please," the woman said, "he's all I have." Isolde took him into her arms and felt the heat beneath his skin. "Sit," she said softly. "We'll keep him warm." She mixed crushed willow bark in wine and spooned it between the boy's lips. He swallowed weakly, then turned his head. The mother watched through tears. At dawn, the boy was gone. Isolde covered him with a sheet and placed a sprig of lavender on his chest. The mother screamed, until her voice broke, then went silent. When she left, she pressed a silver ring into Isolde's palm. Isolde tried to refuse, but the woman shook her head. "You were the only one who came," she said. Days bled into nights. The healer's hands cracked from lye and salt, her fingernails dark from herbs and ash. She began to cough, though she ignored it, blaming the smoke. One morning, she woke with a chill so deep she could not feel her own fingers. She sat by the hearth, staring at her hands, the same hands that had soothed so many brows, now trembling and useless. When the priest came weeks later, he found her still there, sitting upright in her chair. The fire had burned low, casting her face in golden shadow. In her lap lay a small bundle, a folded note written in a steady hand. "Do not fear the touch. It is not death that spreads between us, but love. They buried her at the edge of the marsh, where the wind never stopped moving. And for years afterward, travelers swore they saw a light flickering there at night, as if a single candle still burned for those who had no one left to tend them. In the early days of the sickness, the people had turned to the church as they always had for blessings, for guidance, for the promise that their suffering meant something. Priests moved among the dying with incense swinging from chains, their chants echoing through the lanes like threads of hope. But by the second year, the hope began to rot. The priests were dying faster than the people they anointed. At Street Dunstan's in Canterbury, Father Bernard rose before dawn to ring the bell. It was his duty to mark the hour of matins, but his voice had grown hoarse, his breath shallow. The bell rope scraped against his raw hands as he pulled. He had buried 53 souls that month, and the graveyard behind the church had turned to mud from the constant digging. The other clergy had fled north, leaving him to his parish a congregation that was mostly corpses now. When a messenger from the bishopric arrived, Bernard tried to stand straight, though his knees shook beneath him. "You must close the church," the young man said, his eyes darting about as if the walls themselves might be contagious. "His grace commands all worship to cease. The Lord will hear his people without doors." Bernard only smiled faintly. "The Lord hears the dead too," he said, and shut the door behind him. That night, he heard knocking. A girl stood outside, barefoot, her hands covered in blood. "My father's gone cold," she whispered. "My mother says he needs the rites." He hesitated only a moment before following her. The house reeked of sickness. The father lay twisted on the bed, his mouth open, eyes glassy. Bernard began the prayer of absolution, his words trembling as he sprinkled water over the man's forehead. When he turned to leave, the girl was coughing into her sleeve. 3 days later, the villagers found Bernard lying before the altar. The Bible was open beneath his cheek, his fingers stained with the same dark blotches that had bloomed across the town. The chalice beside him was overturned, the wine dried to rust on the floor. They buried him behind the church, but no one rang the bell. In London, it was the same. Monasteries, once filled with psalms, now echoed only with wind. In the cloisters, the vines grew wild, creeping over tombs and cracked stone. Monks' robes hung limp in the refectory where meals had turned to mould. A few who remained believed the plague was sent to test their faith. Others whispered that it was punishment for pride. But faith and fear shared the same face now: hollow eyes, chapped lips, trembling hands. By Christmas, there were no priests left to bury the dead. The living recited the rites themselves, stumbling through Latin words they barely understood. Children crossed themselves before empty altars, and when the coughing began in their own throats, they did not call for a priest. They called for silence. The church, once the unbroken heart of England, had fallen quiet, its steeples standing, like grave markers, over a land that no longer listened. And though the bells still hung in their towers, none dared to ring them. For every sound that reached heaven now seemed to come back heavier, darker, carrying with it the echo of a question no prayer could answer. Who will bless the dead when the holy are gone? By the 3rd year, London's air was thick enough to touch. The city had begun to burn itself clean, or so people said. Fires smouldered day and night in the streets, piled high with herbs and straw, damp cloth, and the bodies of stray dogs thought to carry the plague. The scent was unbearable, a sickly mix of sage, tar, and death, but still they burned, believing that smoke might do what prayers could not. The mayor's decree was nailed to every post: light fires in every quarter, purify the air with flame and fragrance. So they did. In Cheapside, merchants dragged old crates and shutters into the squares. In Southwark, they tore down abandoned shacks for timber. The watchmen lit torches at dawn, moving from street to street until the whole city smouldered beneath a red haze. Even the Thames seemed to steam with it, the fog rising in curtains that blurred the rooftops. In the alleys, children played among the fires until their mothers pulled them away, faces streaked with soot. The wealthy fled to their manors in the hills, but smoke followed them even there, carried by the wind, blackening the sky as if the world itself was being unmade. Near Cornhill, a tanner named Osric tended a pyre outside his workshop. His wife had died in July, his 2 sons in August. Now he burned anything left behind, their clothes, their bedding, even their shoes. "To cleanse," he muttered as he tossed them into the flames. When neighbors asked why he stayed, he said he wanted to smell the end coming. Every evening he sat beside the fire until the embers turned blue, his eyes glassy from the heat. One morning, they found him slumped forward in the ashes, his hands still black with soot. At St. Mary's, the clergy joined the city's madness. They filled brass censers with herbs and marched through the churchyard in slow processions, swinging smoke into the wind. "The pest comes through the air," Father Allard declared, "and so we fight it with fire." His voice cracked as he spoke, his skin pale with fever. 2 days later, his body was added to the pile outside the nave. The sky itself seemed to dim. Travelers approaching from the countryside said the smoke hung over London like a storm that never broke. It muffled sound, turned the sun to a dull orange coin, and coated every surface in a fine grey dust. Those who survived began to cough from the smoke as much as from the sickness. Windows stayed shuttered, and candles burned through the day because the light could not reach the ground. But for all its choking weight, the city could not stop burning. Fire had become a kind of prayer, a desperate act of defiance against the unseen enemy. Each flicker of flame was a heartbeat, a reminder that someone was still alive. When the rains finally came, the fires hissed and died, leaving London slick and black, the cobblestones gleaming like obsidian. The smell lingered, trapped in every wall and garment, and when the mist rolled in again from the river, thicker and colder than before, the people realized the truth. They had been burning to avoid the smoke had not driven death away. It had only taught it how to hide. In the ruins of Norwich, children began to rule the streets. No bells rang for them, no priests came to guide them, and no mothers called them home before nightfall. They wandered barefoot through the lanes, faces smudged with ash and soot, scavenging crusts of bread from windowsills and half-burned loaves from the market stalls that no one had the heart to guard anymore. The city, once proud with its cathedral spire gleaming above the rooftops, now looked like a graveyard with chimneys. There had been an orphanage, once street, Agnes House, run by sisters who wore black veils and sang hymns before supper. But when the plague came, the sisters locked the doors from inside. For 3 days, smoke rose from its chimneys, and the children outside thought they were safe within. On the 4th morning, the windows went dark. By the week's end, the doors were sealed with lime. Those who remained in the streets stopped passing by. The building stood silent, its name carved above the gate like a memory that refused to fade. The orphans gathered instead in the shell of an old weaving hall near the river. There were 12 of them at first, then 20. They slept on straw, huddled together for warmth, feeding the fire with scraps of broken chairs. The eldest, a girl named Maud, had been 14 when her family vanished, her father a cooper, her mother a midwife. Now she led them, her voice soft but firm, her eyes older than her years. She taught them how to boil water before drinking it, how to tell when the air smelled wrong, and how to listen for the cough that meant they should run. Each dawn, Maud sent the younger ones to search the streets for food. They found apples shriveled on carts, crumbs under tables, once even a live chicken that had wandered into the square. They laughed when they caught it, though none of them had laughed in months. That night, they roasted it slowly over the coals, the scent filling the hall. For a moment, they were only children again, but laughter did not last long in Norwich. One morning, the youngest boy, Tom, woke with his eyes glazed and his neck swollen. He whimpered for water. Maud held his hand and sang to him until his breathing stopped. They buried him behind the hall, digging with spoons because the ground was too hard for their fingers. No one spoke afterward. The next morning, 2 more fell ill. When winter came, snow covered the streets, muting every sound. The city looked almost peaceful under its white shroud. Maud stood at the broken doorway, her breath rising in clouds, and watched the flakes settle over the graves they had made. Behind her, the others slept, their faces thin, their dreams quiet. By spring, the hall was empty again. Travellers passing through Norwich found only small footprints in the dust and a ring of stones where the fire had been. The townsfolk later said that some of the orphans had survived, that they'd joined pilgrims heading south. Others whispered that they had gone, together, into the woods and laid down in the snow, tired of running. No one ever opened Street Agnes House again. The doors remained sealed, the windows dark, the carving above the gate eroding one letter at a time, and when the wind blew from the river, it sometimes carried the faint sound of children's voices, a ghostly echo of laughter that refused to die, long after the last living child in Norwich had fallen silent. The first sign was the rider. He came from York, alone, his cloak torn by wind, his horse limping from miles of road. The people of Lincoln saw him before dawn, a shadow moving through the mist, head bowed, mouth wrapped in linen. He rode straight to the church square, dismounted without a word, and pounded on the shutter of the bailiff's house. By the time the man inside opened the door, the rider was already on his knees. "They're all gone," he said. His voice was cracked, as though he had swallowed dust. "York is dead." The bailiff pulled him inside, but the rider's words had already carried through the street. Windows opened. Faces appeared. Someone asked, "Gone where?" The rider only looked up and whispered, "Into the earth." He had been a courier for the King's Post, a man used to distance and danger. His name was Stephen, though few learned it before the end. He told them how the bells in York had rung without pause for 9 days before they fell, silent. How the Minster's towers stood blackened from the fires of the pyres. How the yews ran thick with ashes, the smoke so heavy it turned the sky to copper. "The pest moves north and south now," he said. "It rides the roads faster than we can flee it." The bailiff ordered him to rest, to eat, to drink, but Stephen refused. "I must warn the towns ahead," he said, tightening his gloves. The townsfolk pleaded with him to stay, to hide, to take shelter. "You cannot outrun it," one woman cried. Stephen looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not outrunning it," he said softly. "I'm leading it away." By evening, he was gone again. Those who had spoken to him began to cough within 2 days. The message spread faster than he did. From Lincoln to Nottingham, to Leicester, to Oxford, a wave of panic rippled through the shires. In some towns, people fled at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, believing the rider himself carried the curse. In others, they barricaded the roads, raising wooden barriers and hanging garlands of garlic over the gates. But the sickness needed no rider. It travelled by air, by flea, by touch. Wherever the wind blew, the dead soon followed. In the north, a monk at Durham recorded the story in his chronicle. A messenger rode before the plague like a herald before a king. Wherever his horse passed, death followed behind by 3 days' ride. The tale spread, growing with each retelling. Some said he was an angel of warning, others an omen of judgment. A few swore they saw him even after all England had fallen silent, a figure cloaked in ash, riding a pale horse through the fog. When the road between York and London was finally abandoned, travellers still found hoofprints in the mud, single lines cutting through the empty countryside, fading toward the south. No one ever found Stephen's body, nor his horse. But the villagers said that when the wind shifted, you could still hear hooves on the road at night, slow, deliberate, echoing through the darkness. Not galloping, not fleeing, just riding on, bearing a message no one was left alive to receive. On a hill above the River Trent stood St. Hilda's Abbey, a stone fortress of faith that had watched over the valley for 200 years. Pilgrims once climbed the path to its gates, their songs rising like birds through the morning mist. But by the winter of 1350, the singing had stopped. The road to the abbey was empty, except for crows. and the great bell that had once called the faithful to prayer hung motionless in its tower, its clapper rusted still. Within the cloister walls a few monks remained. They moved slowly through the corridors, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone. The scent of incense and wax had long been replaced by the heavier smell of vinegar and smoke. The refectory, where once 100 brothers had broken bread together, now served as both chapel and infirmary. Half the benches had been cleared away to make room for pallets of straw. Brother Oswin kept the ledger. Each morning he dipped his quill into the ink pot and wrote down another, name Brother Matthew, Brother Paul, Brother Clement, until the parchment ran out. When no ink remained, he burned the quill for warmth. "The Lord knows the rest," he whispered. The abbot, Father Richard, refused to abandon the abbey. "We are the keepers of prayer," he said. "If we leave, the light of faith will die." So they stayed, fasting when the bread was gone, boiling herbs when the fever came. They sang the psalms in hoarse voices, though no harmony remained, only ragged murmurs rising from tired throats. By Lent, only 7 brothers were left. They gathered each morning in the chapel to recite the office, their voices trembling beneath the high vaults. The frescoes of saints on the walls had begun to flake, their faces crumbling like dust. The candles sputtered in the draught, casting shadows that moved like figures along the stone. One night, a storm broke over the valley. Wind howled through the cloisters, rattling the shutters. Lightning lit the abbey courtyard in flashes of silver. In the dormitory, Brother Oswin awoke to a sound, not thunder, but coughing. He rose to find Father Richard kneeling before the altar, clutching his chest, his lips black with blood. "Go back to bed, my son," the abbot gasped. "God will take me in his time." But Oswin stayed beside him until his breathing ceased, the last prayer unfinished. When morning came, the brothers gathered in silence. They wrapped the abbot's body in his robe and buried him beneath the yew tree by the cloister gate. Afterward, they sat in the courtyard, listening to the rain drip from the arches. "Who will lead us now?" one asked. "No one," Oswin said. "We are already ghosts." By Easter, the abbey was empty. The wind carried dust through the corridors, scattering loose pages of scripture across the floor. The last candle burned down to a puddle of wax beside the altar. Years later, travelers passing along the river spoke of a strange sound at dusk. The faint echo of chanting carried on the wind, rising and falling like breath. They said it came from the hill, where the ruins of Street Hildas stood shrouded in ivy, and on still nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the bell not ringing but sighing as if the stone itself remembered the prayers of the dead. By the time spring returned, the earth could take no more. The churchyards were full, the graves stacked deep, and still the dead came. The diggers had long since fled or fallen, leaving only the desperate to bury their own. In the villages that ringed the fens of Cambridgeshire, people began to dig pits outside their walls wide. Raw, open holes in the ground that smoked when the wind turned. The soil was too wet for proper burial, too soft to hold shape. The bodies sank into it like stones in water. When even that failed, they turned to fire. In one hamlet near Ely, the first pyre was built behind the mill. The air was still, and the sky hung low, grey as tin. Men gathered in silence, their faces wrapped in rags soaked with vinegar. They said no prayers, not out of irreverence, but exhaustion. The priest was dead, the sexton too, so they did what they could. They stacked timber, then laid the bodies one by one, father beside son, mother beside daughter, and poured oil over the linen. When the flame took, it leapt higher than the trees, a column of orange swallowing the mist. The villagers watched from a distance. The smell hit first sweet, thick, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their memories. No one spoke. Children pressed their faces into their mothers' skirts. A man crossed himself, his hand trembling, then stopped midway as if unsure whether it mattered any more. For days the fire burned. They fed it with wood from barns, with furniture, with anything that would catch. At night, the wind carried sparks over the rooftops, and the people lay awake, afraid of fire and death both. The ashes drifted into the fields, coating the barley shoots, settling in the wells. At dawn, a woman named Cecily went to draw water. She had lost her husband and 2 sons the week before, but her youngest still lived, a boy barely 4. She lowered the bucket and heard it splash, but when she pulled it up, the water shimmered grey, flecked with soot. The smell made her gag. She poured it out and tried again. The second bucket was worse. She stared at the surface, at the faint reflection of her face ringed in ash. Then she dropped the rope, turned, and walked home without a word. Within days, people began to sicken again. Those who had survived the winter, who had dared to hope the worst was over. They blamed the wells. Some sealed them with stones. Others dug new ones farther from the fields, but the wind betrayed them. The ashes were everywhere now, in the soil, in the bread, in the air they breathed. When a storm finally came, it swept through the valley with sheets of rain, washing the last embers from the pyres. The water ran black down the lanes, filling the ditches with ash and memory. Years later, grass grew over the place where the fires had burned. The land was quiet again, green and soft. But when the wind blew hard from the east, the soil still shifted oddly, and sometimes, in the shimmer of dust, a faint white gleam could be seen beneath the surface, like bone. The villagers called it the Well of Ashes. They did not drink from it, nor build near it. They said the ground there never froze, even in deepest winter, as though the fire beneath had never really gone out. The living slept lightly now, if they slept at all. When dusk fell across the plague-stricken city, men with torches and cudgels took to the streets not out of courage, but necessity. They were the night watch, sworn by coin and fear to keep order after dark, to guard against thieves, looters, and the desperate who crept from their sealed homes in search of food. But even the watch could not guard against what moved in the air. In London, the watch numbered few. Half had already fallen sick. The others walked their rounds with linen pressed to their faces and prayers muttered into the folds. They moved through lanes that had once been crowded with taverns and traders, now emptied but for the sound of their own boots echoing against the stones. Behind shuttered windows, the dying coughed in rhythm with their steps. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, muffled by fog. Thomas Gren, the youngest of the watch, carried a lantern so small its light barely reached his boots. His sergeant had warned him to keep his eyes forward and his thoughts short. "You look too long at death, lad," the man had said, "and it starts looking back." But Thomas could not help glancing into doorways as he passed. Once he saw a woman sitting beside an open window, her head bowed as if in prayer. He raised his lantern to speak, but she did not move. Only then did he see the dark stain on her gown, spreading like spilled ink. By midnight, the fog thickened. The air smelled of tallow and smoke from the pyres upriver. The watch made its way toward Cheapside, where the carts waited to collect the dead come morning. The horses stamped restlessly, their breath rising like ghosts. The men counted the carts by habit 10 tonight, where there had been 8 yesterday. Numbers were the only thing that still made sense. At the edge of the market square they found a door ajar. A black cross had been painted on it days ago, but the seal was broken. The sergeant motioned for silence. Thomas pushed the door open with his staff, his heart hammering. The house smelled of mould and vinegar. Candles had burned low on the table, their wax pooled and hardened. On the floor lay a small body wrapped in linen, and beside it, a bowl of untouched bread. "Leave it," the sergeant said. "They'll come for them at dawn." But Thomas knelt anyway. The child's hand was small, pale, and cold as marble. He whispered something he would not remember what, and rose again. Outside, the fog swallowed the house whole. As the hours dragged toward dawn, the watch moved slower, their torches dimming. The silence of the city pressed close, as if listening. Once, they heard singing a single voice somewhere deep in the mist, chanting the Lord's Prayer in a language none of them recognized. When they turned toward it, the sound stopped. By sunrise, the men were back at their post by the gate. Thomas set his lantern down and wiped his face. His sergeant lit a pipe and stared at the horizon, where the light was the color of bruises. "You did well, lad," he said. "We kept the peace." But as Thomas looked back at the sleeping city, he realized what the man had not. There was no peace left to keep, only a quiet, too deep, too heavy, the kind that comes when even the living have learned to move like ghosts among the dead. When the morning bell failed to ring, no one noticed. There was no longer a market to call to. The stalls that had once crowded London's Cheapside, a living maze of colour, noise, and bargaining, stood deserted beneath a pale, dust-choked sun. The canopies had sagged with rain and ash, the bolts of cloth beneath them gnawed through by rats. Wooden signs creaked in the wind, pointing to trades that no longer existed: butcher, baker, cooper, chandler. The letters, once painted in gold and red, now flaked away like scabs. A woman named Joan, one of the few still breathing in that part of the city, wandered the rows each dawn. She carried a basket, though there was nothing left to fill it with. Habit drew her there, the rhythm of walking where she used to walk, standing where she used to sell bread beside her husband's stall. He had died in August, her 2 sons in September. Now she came alone, her face wrapped in linen, her hands blistered from scrubbing the stone floor of her home, though no amount of washing could drive the smell away. Some days she spoke aloud, pretending the others were still there. "A farthing for a loaf," she would whisper, her voice cracking, "fresh from the oven, warm as sunrise." But the air gave no answer, only the cawing of crows that had made their roosts along the roof lines. They watched her with dull black eyes, patient as undertakers. Beyond the square, the wind carried the faint chiming of metal. Someone, or something, was moving among the stalls. Joan froze, clutching her basket to her chest. From the mist emerged a man dragging a handcart. He wore a leather apron blackened with soot, his face hidden by a mask of cloth. "Any food?" he asked hoarsely. His voice was thin, cracked from thirst. Joan shook her head. "Nothing," she said. "It's all gone." He looked at her for a long moment before pulling a small loaf from his cart, hard as stone. "Take it," he said. "It's not for the living anymore." Then he turned and vanished down Bread Street, his cart rattling over the cobbles until the sound faded into silence. That night, Joan broke the loaf with trembling hands. The bread tasted of smoke and salt, and she cried as she ate, not from hunger but from memory, the taste of what once meant life, now a relic of the dead. By week's end, the market had become a burial ground. The carts came not for goods but for bodies, piling them where the stalls had stood. The smell of rot mixed with old spices from the apothecary booths and the sour tang of wine spilled from broken barrels. The city watch no longer patrolled. The ravens did that now, hopping from cart to cart as if counting the fallen. One morning in December, a heavy snow began to fall, covering everything in white. The stalls, the carts, the bodies, all vanished beneath the weight of it. By noon, the market looked untouched, pure again. But beneath that silence, beneath the snow, lay the memory of 1,000 voices shouting prices, laughing, singing. When spring came, the snow melted, revealing only splintered wood and bones scattered like forgotten coins. The market had not vanished, it had simply changed hands. What had once belonged to merchants and buyers now belonged to the wind, to the crows, and to time itself, which exacted the fairest price of all. Everything. He was small enough to slip between fences, and silent enough to walk unnoticed through the fields of the dead. No one remembered his name. Some called him the Grave Boy. Others simply pointed when they saw him kneeling by the churchyard wall, counting under his breath. He could not have been more than 10, though hunger and dust had carved his face into something older. His hair was matted with ash, his hands grey with earth. He carried a bundle of pebbles in his pocket, his way of keeping count when numbers had grown too heavy for words. Each morning, as mist rose over the parish of Street Brides, he came to the burial ground. The grave diggers were long gone. The pits, once neatly measured, had become gaping wounds in the soil. He did not dig, the earth was too full already. Instead, He knelt at the edge, muttering the same prayer over and over, for the ones who sleep. Each time he finished, he dropped a stone beside him. Then he began again. At first, people thought he was mad, another orphan gone hollow from grief. But those who dared to follow him noticed how careful he was. He walked the same path each day, touching the fence posts as he went, as though greeting old friends. He stopped at the corner where the oldest graves lay, the ones without markers, only mounds of earth, and placed a white pebble on each. Sometimes he whispered names he invented: Thomas, Anne, Father Gregory. Other times he said nothing at all. One afternoon, a woman from the village approached him. She had buried her husband only 2 days before, and came hoping to see where the gravediggers had laid him. "Do you know," she asked, "where the last cart was emptied?" The boy nodded and led her wordlessly through the rows. When they reached the trench, she froze. There was no marker, only soil pressed flat by rain. He crouched down, dug through the dirt, and pulled out one of his stones, smooth, round, and grey, placing it gently at her feet. "Now he's counted," the boy said. After that, people began leaving him gifts: crusts of bread, an apple, sometimes a scrap of cloth. He never thanked them, only tucked the food away and kept counting. By autumn, the pile of stones beside the fence had grown into a small cairn, grey against the dark soil. Then, one morning, he did not come. Days passed. The villagers whispered that he had taken sick, or perhaps wandered into the woods. But when a shepherd crossed the burial field weeks later, he found a small figure curled beside the cairn, his arms wrapped around the stones as if protecting them. The frost had settled gently on his face. They buried him beneath the yew tree at the edge of the churchyard, marking the spot with a single smooth pebble, his own. No priest was left to bless it, no mother came to weep. Yet when the wind passed through the branches, the stones beneath them rattled softly, as if shifting in response, like a boy still counting, even after the world had stopped. In the cloistered quiet of Cambridge, where the cobbled streets wound between shuttered houses, and the river carried only the sound of oars, a single physician still worked. His name was Master Robert Cleave, a scholar once known for his steady hands and sharper mind. Before the pestilence, he had lectured in the university halls, arguing with other learned men about the humours of the body and the movements of the stars. Now, the lecture halls were empty, their benches covered in dust, and Robert's students lay buried in the fields beyond the town. He lived in a narrow stone house near the King's Ditch, its windows sealed with waxed cloth to keep the miasma out. The air inside smelled of vinegar and rosemary, of ink and fatigue. Books lay open across his table, their margins filled with feverish notes, lists of symptoms, sketches of boils, speculations about causes. He had stopped writing prayers months ago. He wrote only observations now, as if logic alone could keep him sane. Each morning he walked the streets with his mask and staff, visiting the sick who still called for him. The rich offered coin and jewels for his attention. The poor offered nothing but trust. He went to both. He bled no one, prescribed no leeches, and told no lies. He could ease pain, but not prevent death. And he had learned that truth was its own kind of medicine. In one house, he found a scholar's widow sitting beside her husband's body. "You studied together," she said. "He admired you." Robert nodded and knelt by the corpse. The man's eyes were still open, his face turned toward the window. "He died looking for light," the widow whispered. Robert reached out and closed the man's eyelids. "Then let him rest in the dark," he said. Each night he burned his clothes, scrubbed his hands until the skin bled, and waited to feel the first sign of fever in himself. It never came. The students who had once gathered to learn from him would have called it providence, but Robert no longer believed in that. He believed in chance, the same chance that spared one man and took 10 others. As the months passed, he grew thinner, his hair streaked white before its time. He began talking to the pages of his books, asking questions aloud. "Why this fever?" he asked one night, staring at a diagram of the human heart. Why this hunger in the air? When no answer came, he dipped his quill and wrote, "The pestilence is not God's anger, it is his absence." The next morning, the university bell rang for the first time in weeks. Robert went to the window and saw the townsfolk gathering outside the chapel. They carried no coffins, only torches. The pyres burned brighter than ever, and the smoke rose straight into the grey sky. That night, Robert sat by his table with a candle guttering low. He picked up his quill one last time and wrote, "All cures fail when the body of the world itself is sick." Then he folded the paper and slipped it between the pages of his journal. They found him the next day, seated upright, his hands clasped as if in prayer. The candle had burned itself to nothing. On the table beside him lay an open book, his own notes, and across the final page, a single dark blot of ink, dried in the shape of a tear. High in the Derbyshire hills lay a small village called Eyam, a place of stone cottages and narrow lanes where the wind carried the scent of heather from the moors. Before the sickness came, its people had lived quietly tending sheep, weaving cloth, ringing the church bell each Sunday without fail. But in the late summer of 1351, a parcel of cloth arrived from London, sent to the local tailor for mending. It was damp from the journey, wrapped in burlap, and heavy with more than fabric. Within a week, the tailor was dead, then his apprentice, then the widow who washed his clothes. The villagers gathered in the churchyard, terrified. They had heard the stories of towns emptied, of fields overgrown, of cities gone silent. The pestilence, they were told, travelled through air, through touch, through the very breath of the living, and yet it had come all the same. It was the rector, Reverend William Mompesson, who spoke first. His voice trembled but held steady. "If we flee," he said, "we take death with us. If we stay, perhaps it dies here." The people murmured, crossing themselves. Some wept, some raged, but his words settled over them like frost, heavy, still, final. That night, the villagers agreed to seal the road, to cut themselves off from the world. They would die here if they must, but they would not carry the curse beyond their walls. At dawn, they set to work. Stones were dragged across the lanes, the paths leading into the valley barricaded with timber. A post was driven into the earth at the edge of the road, where outsiders might leave food or medicine. Coins were dropped into a bowl of vinegar for exchange, though few dared to approach. From that day on, no one left Eyam. Weeks passed. The church doors were nailed open to let the air move through, and sermons were preached from the hillside so that the people could stand apart. Families dug graves in their gardens to avoid the crowded yard. Children played no more. Lovers met only through windows. When the coughing began at night, the others prayed they would not hear it again in the morning. Autumn came, and with it, the smell of decay. The moors, once bright with purple bloom, turned grey beneath the mist. The blacksmith buried his wife behind the forge. The miller, his hands shaking, locked himself in his barn and never came out. Reverend Mompesson's own wife fell ill in November. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand until her breath went still. Afterward, he dug her grave himself. Winter froze the village into silence. Only a few fires burned now, flickering like watchful eyes in the night. The bell no longer tolled for the dead, there were too many. When spring finally came, it brought no joy. But the sickness, at last, was gone. Fewer than a third of Eyam's people remained. They stood together at the boundary stone, staring down the road they had sealed a year before. Grass grew between the cracks, where their barricade had once stood. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. In time, travellers came again, finding the cottages empty, the air still. On the lintel of the church door, someone had carved a single line, "We kept our vow." And though centuries would pass, and the world would forget most of the names, the wind that crossed the Derbyshire hills still carried their silence. The sound of a village that chose to die so others might live. When death had stripped England bare of reason, only faith remained, and even that began to twist. In London and Canterbury, Where once the churches had overflowed with psalms and incense, the pews now stood empty. The pestilence had hollowed the cathedrals into echo chambers, where prayers rose and fell unanswered. Yet out in the roads and fields, new prayers began raw, desperate, ungoverned. Men and women no longer waited for priests. They sought salvation in their own skin. They came first as small groups, barefoot pilgrims walking from town to town, clothed in sackcloth, their backs already bruised. They called themselves the Flagellants, servants of divine justice. Every few paces they stopped, dropped to their knees, and beat themselves with knotted cords until the blood ran. "God sees," they cried, "God remembers." Some said they could smell sin leaving the body through the wounds. Others said the pain was the only thing left that proved they were still alive. Villagers knelt when they passed, torn between awe and fear. Mothers pressed their children's faces into their skirts so they wouldn't see the welts. The Flagellants sang as they walked, their voices hoarse, their words half Latin, half madness. "Mercy, mercy, mercy," they chanted, the rhythm steady as the sound of a heart trying to keep time against the silence of heaven. In York, a friar named Edmund tried to speak against them. "God does not ask for blood," he said from the pulpit. "He asks for repentance." But the crowd below him murmured. They were tired of words, of promises that delivered nothing but graves. The next morning, Edmund's chapel doors were smeared with a red cross, not of plague, but of warning. He left the city that night and was never seen again. Elsewhere, prophecy bloomed like rot. Wandering preachers proclaimed that angels had loosed the sickness to cleanse the world. Some claimed that London would sink into the Thames for its pride, others that the Pope himself would soon choke on his own sins. Villagers carried amulets of brass and bone, inscribed with prayers backwards, believing the devil would flee confusion. Farmers hung herbs above their doors in the shape of crosses, while midwives whispered that the herbs themselves were holy. In the towns where no priests remained, the living began to bury the dead with their own rites. They spoke the words they could remember, then filled the rest with silence. In some places, the mourners placed coins on the tongues of the dead, so that their souls might pay passage not to heaven, but to peace. Faith had become less about salvation and more about survival, a fragile ritual to remind them that they had not yet joined the stillness beneath their feet. By the second winter, the flagellant processions dwindled, their blood dried, their songs cracked into whispers. Those who had once marched beneath banners of salvation now shuffled like ghosts, their backs scarred, their faith turned inward. The church, when it finally tried to reclaim them, found that the people no longer listened. They prayed now to the wind, to the stars, to anything that still moved. The pestilence had not just killed their bodies, it had rewritten their faith. And in that new, uncertain silence, the question that haunted every heart was no longer, "Where is God?" but "What if he was never here at all?" The pestilence had made beggars of kings and kings of gravediggers. In the spring of 1352, the sickness crept into Windsor itself, climbing past the moat, through the halls of stone, into the chambers where England's royalty had sought to outwait death. They had fled London months before, the king and his court retreating into what they called pure air, a fiction that withered faster than the roses in the courtyard. The courtiers had burned rosemary in their rooms, sealed the windows with beeswax, and ordered the servants not to breathe too close to them. Yet no perfumed air nor golden seal could keep contagion from crossing the threshold. They said the first to fall was a page, a boy of 12, who carried messages between chambers. He had coughed during supper, a small, pitiful sound that drew every eye. The next morning, he was found cold in his bed, his skin bruised beneath his arms. Panic spread faster than the plague itself. Servants fled through the plastic corridors, abandoning trays and linens. The sound of their boots echoed through halls that had once rung with laughter. King Edward himself, the same who had once marched across France, with banners snapping in the wind, shut himself in his private chapel. He spent hours on his knees, the candlelight flickering over his face. "Lord," he whispered, You made me your sword, do not now make me your victim." But the only reply was the soft hiss of wax dripping onto the altar cloth. The courtiers who remained debated feverishly. Should the king flee farther north? Should they burn the castle's halls? Some argued it was treason to abandon him. Others argued that God had already turned his back. Before any decision was made, 2 more servants died, and one of the royal physicians collapsed mid-prayer, his face striking the marble floor with a sound that carried through the chapel like thunder. By the 3rd week, the castle smelled of vinegar and smoke. The queen and her ladies took refuge in the garden, where they slept beneath linen tents to escape the poisoned air indoors. It was there, among the peacocks and fountains, that one of her maids began to cough. The queen ordered her carried away, but her eyes followed the girl's body as it was dragged toward the gate. When the coughing started among the others, she stopped giving orders altogether. In the city below, word spread that the king was dead. The rumor was false, but not entirely. Edward survived, though the man who emerged from Windsor weeks later was not the same. His hair had gone grey, his eyes hollow. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were strange. "I have seen my kingdom," he told his steward, "and it lies beneath the soil." The throne endured, but the divine right that once glittered like armor had turned to dust. For the first time in living memory, the people spoke of kings as mortal men, not chosen vessels. They said that when Edward finally left Windsor, he ordered the chapel doors sealed behind him, not out of fear, but shame. Inside, the altars still gleamed, the candles still stood, and on the marble floor, where the physician had fallen, the stain of his blood would not wash away. Thus even the crown had learned the same lesson as the peasant, that death did not bow, it only waited, and when it came, it cared nothing for gold or prayer or the trembling of kings. The summer after the plague's worst year should have been a season of renewal, wheat rising high, orchards swelling with fruit, the rhythm of life resuming in the fields. But England's soil had been left to mourn, where once hundreds bent their backs to the plough, now only a few scattered figures worked the land, their tools rusted from disuse, their strength spent by hunger and grief. The fields themselves seemed to remember the silence. They grew wild and uneven, the furrows swallowed by weeds. In Suffolk, the old manor farms stood empty, their roofs sagging under the weight of crows. The wind carried the smell of loam and ash from forgotten pyres. Skeletons of oxen lay beside broken carts, their harnesses rotted through. The harvesters who remained went barefoot and wordless, cutting wheat that had grown too tall to manage. They stacked the sheaves but left them standing in the fields, too few hands to bind, too few mouths to feed. A man named Wulfric tended one such field. He had been a tenant farmer before the sickness, bound to a lord who now lay buried in the orchard behind the manor. Wulfric had lost his wife and 3 children before winter. He no longer prayed. He worked because he did not know what else to do. Each morning, he sharpened his scythe with the same slow rhythm, the ring of steel echoing through the valley. When he looked up, he saw no smoke from neighboring farms, no figures on the distant hills, only the empty sky watching back. The soil was rich with death. Digging for roots one day, Wulfric unearthed a jawbone, its teeth still white, the earth clinging to it like old cloth. He set it on a fence post and kept digging. Later he found another, then a skull, then a hand still curled as if holding something invisible. Soon there were dozens. The fields had become a harvest of bones. He began to gather them, stacking them neatly along the edge of his land, not out of superstition, but respect. "You worked this ground," he murmured. "You should not lie forgotten." By midsummer, the pile reached higher than his shoulders, ribs and femurs, skulls and finger bones gleaming pale against the soil. The crows perched atop them, crying out into the stillness. When travelers passed through the valley weeks later, they found Wulfric sitting beside the mound, his scythe across his knees. They asked if he was guarding it. He shook his head. "Counting," he said, "to see if the land remembers." By autumn, The wind scattered the bones across the fields again, mixing them back into the earth. The plough would one day turn them over, and the cycle would begin anew, bone to dust, dust to seed. The villagers who returned years later said their wheat grew tall and white there, the color of linen. They called it the ghost field. And when the wind swept through it at dusk, the stalks rattled softly together, not like crops, but like memory, the faint whisper of a nation that had buried too much to ever grow quiet again. The first frost came early that year, sharp and merciless, turning the rivers to glass before the last of the leaves had fallen. What little harvest there was lay rotting in the fields, too sparse to fill the granaries. The survivors of the pestilence, gaunt and hollow-eyed, gathered what they could: turnips frozen to the ground, apples shriveled black on the bough. Smoke rose thinly from the chimneys that still stood, each one marking a house where someone had outlasted the sickness, but not yet outlasted hunger. They called it the Black Winter, not for plague, but for the cold that followed it, a silence deeper than any death. With so few hands left to tend the land, the roads were buried under snow and drifted branches. Wolves came down from the forests, moving through the villages like ghosts. They howled in the nights when the moon hung low, their cries blending with the creak of settling roofs. In a cottage near the ruins of Gloucester, an old woman named Hilda tended a proscal, small fire. She had survived the sickness by hiding in her root cellar, living on onions and rainwater. Now she survived by memory. Each morning she rose to feed the fire and speak aloud the names of her children. 3 gone to fever, 1 to hunger. The sound of her own voice reassured her that she still existed. The walls around her dripped with meltwater, and the thatch sagged under the weight of ice. When strangers passed through the valley, Hilda would beckon them to her hearth. "Sit," she'd say. "You must keep moving after dawn. The frost takes hold of the bones first." Some stayed an hour, some a night, leaving behind bits of food or scraps of cloth. They said she had eyes like coals, burning in the dark. To those who lingered, she told the same story of the first snow that fell on the churchyard, blanketing the mounds until even the crosses vanished. "God has covered them," she'd whisper. "He wants us to forget." But the land did not forget. In the frayed morning light, black shapes showed through the snow where the ground had sunk, graves collapsing under the weight of ice. The wind hissed through the trees like a whispering crowd. People began to dream of the dead standing outside their doors, shaking the frost from their shoulders, asking to be let in. By midwinter, the rivers froze solid, and carts could cross them as though over stone. The cold reached into the marrow of things, into the wells, into the churches, even into the bells that cracked when rung. In the cathedrals that still stood, priests burned furniture for warmth, their hymns muffled by the smoke. One night, a storm swept across the country, a blizzard so fierce it erased everything, sky and earth indistinguishable. When dawn broke, entire hamlets had disappeared beneath snowdrifts. Travelers found doorways sealed in ice, candles still burning inside. The thaw came late and slow. When the snow finally receded, it left behind a landscape bleached of color, trees split by frost, rivers swollen with melt, and fields scattered with the bones the earth could no longer hide. The survivors would remember that winter not for hunger, nor for cold, but for the silence, the kind that froze not just the body, but the heart. They said even the birds had forgotten their songs. Only the wind remained, sweeping over the white hills, carrying with it the sigh of all who had endured too long. When the snows melted and the first shoots of green returned to the hedgerows, England awoke, but not to life as it had been. The living stepped out of their doors as if into another world. The roads that once thrummed with wagons and laughter now lay cracked and overgrown. The rivers ran clear again, but no boats moved upon them. Birds returned to the skies, singing into silence. For the first time in years, there was color, and no one left who remembered how to celebrate it. Those who survived did not look like victors. Their faces were thin, their hands calloused, their eyes too wide. Some had buried whole families, Others had fled so far from the dead that they could no longer recall the way home. The plague had not chosen who it spared, only who it left behind to remember. And memory, they learned, was its own kind of fever. In a hamlet near Oxford, 7 people lived where 200 once had. They gathered in the church each Sunday, not for worship, but for company. The altar was gone, burned during the black months for warmth. The pews were uneven, half rotted, the air still smelling faintly of smoke and damp stone. A woman named Alice read aloud from a torn Bible, her voice low but steady. She no longer wore the cross that used to hang around her neck. "We are the proof," she said once, though none of them knew proof of what. Food was scarce, but the land had grown wild and generous in neglect. Orchards drooped with unpicked fruit. Hares leapt freely across the meadows. The survivors gathered together at harvest, unsure whether to thank God or luck. When they spoke, their words came softly, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts that might still be listening. Children born, after the pestilence, grew up in the ruins. They played among toppled gravestones and built their games from fragments of what came before: a gilded spoon, a bit of stained glass, a piece of armor turned toy. They asked their parents why the cities were so quiet, why no bells rang anymore. The adults only shook their heads. Some lied and said the world had been reborn. Others said nothing at all. In London, grass grew in the streets. Wolves prowled the outskirts at night, and the sound of their howls carried down the Thames. But the city did not die entirely. From the ashes of markets and monasteries came a new kind of order, not of kings or bishops, but of survivors bound by need. Bakers shared ovens. Smiths taught one another their trade. No one spoke of rank anymore. Death had made them equals. At twilight, when the fog rolled in from the river, some still claimed to hear the echoes of what once was the bells of Street. Paul's, faint and far away, ringing for a world that refused to stay buried. Others said it was only the wind through broken windows, playing at memory. Whatever it was, the survivors did not cover their ears. They listened, because in the hush after so much death, even sorrow sounded like a promise that the earth, weary but patient, still remembered how to breathe. When the dead stopped falling, the world had to learn how to stand again. But the ground it rose upon was no longer the same. Across England, a strange reversal took hold. A kingdom built on order and obedience suddenly left without masters, without laws, without hands to command or obey. The pestilence had not only emptied graves, it had emptied thrones and fields alike. The rich, who once looked down from manor walls, now bent their backs to the soil, while those who had always served found themselves holding the keys. In the county of Kent, the manor of Haverley had once housed 50 souls, servants, stewards, shepherds, cooks. After the plague, only 3 remained: a widow named Ellen, her teenage son, and the steward's apprentice, who had returned from burying his family in Canterbury. The Lord was gone. His wife and daughters had fled south and never returned. The manor's great hall stood open to the wind, its tapestries rotting, the hearth cold. Ellen, who had once scrubbed the floors of that hall on her knees, now sat at the long oak table and ate from silver. She did not call herself mistress, but there was no one left to tell her she wasn't. When spring came, she walked the fields with her son, deciding which plots to plough, which to let rest. "We'll sow what we can," she said. "If no one else will reap it, we shall." The boy nodded, though neither of them knew how to farm. The world beyond Haverley was changing in ways no king had foreseen. In villages from Norfolk to Somerset, peasants began demanding wages, real coin, not the promise of bread or shelter. "The Lord is dead," they said. "The land still needs hands." And for the first time, their hands had value. Fields that had once been tended by hundreds now depended on a dozen, and the dozen named their price. Some lords called it rebellion, others called it necessity. But even as new life sprouted from the soil, the old order cracked like dry wood. In manors left unguarded, servants claimed the rooms they once cleaned. They wore their masters' coats and slept in feather beds, not out of vanity but survival. In London, merchants opened shops in the shells of noble houses. The guilds grew stronger, the clergy weaker. And in every corner of the country, the people whispered that God had leveled the world. Yet equality, like plague, spread unevenly. For every woman who took her late husband's trade, another starved beside the ruins of a church. For every boy who became a master of his own plot, another wandered the roads, begging for work in fields still haunted by memory. Ellen saw it in the faces of those who passed by her gate-gaunt travellers carrying shovels and hope in equal measure. Some she took in, others she could not. Her son once asked her, "Are we rich now?" She looked at the empty fields and the sky beyond them. "No," she said, "there are no rich anymore, only the living." By the year's end, Haverley's crops grew tall, though few came to harvest them. The weeds rose alongside the wheat, stubborn and green. And when the wind swept across the fields at dusk, it made no distinction between them, both bowed in the same rhythm, both equal beneath the same indifferent sky. On the road between Ely and Cambridge stood the church of Street Oswald, once a proud stone beacon for miles around. Its bell tower had watched over generations' weddings, harvests, christenings, the slow and certain tolling for the dead. But after the pestilence, it watched over nothing. The fields around it lay bare. The cottages that once sent smoke curling into the air had collapsed inward like tired lungs. The road that led to its door had vanished beneath grass. For a long while, no one dared approach it. They said the church was cursed, that those who entered came out changed or not at all. The stories spread, of candles that lit themselves after dark, of whispers under the eaves, of a smell faint, metallic, and wrong that lingered in the air long after the last rites had been said. But in truth, there were no curses, only silence. Inside, the pews were coated in dust, the altar draped in cobweb. Rats skittered across the flagstones, nesting in the pulpit where sermons had once rung out. The stained glass windows, so bright in the years before, now looked like bruises. Their saints faded, their halos cracked. The wind moaned through the gaps in the roof, turning scripture into sighs. One evening in late autumn, a traveller named Jonah sought shelter there. He was a mason by trade, or had been, before the sickness took every patron and every city worth building in. Now he walked the countryside, trading repairs for food, his tools clinking faintly at his belt. When he saw the church rising from the mist, he thought it a safe place to sleep. Stone, after all, could not rot. He pushed the heavy doors open, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was cool and heavy. He set down his bundle, lit a small lamp, and stood in the nave, staring up at the empty rafters. "You've seen better days," he murmured. His voice echoed. That night, the wind rose. Jonah sat by his small fire near the altar, listening. Now and then, he thought he heard a movement, the soft shuffle of feet on the stone. When he called out, there was no answer. Still, he felt less alone, and for a man who had buried too many, that was almost comfort. Before he slept, he took a piece of chalk from his pack and drew a cross on the floor beside him. "For luck," he said. At dawn, the fire had gone out, and mist filled the church like breath. Jonah stirred, his bones aching, and went to leave. But as he turned toward the door, he saw footprints in the dust, small ones, leading from the pews to the altar and stopping at the place where he had slept. He crouched, touched the marks. The dust was undisturbed elsewhere. He left without looking back. Years later, when villagers returned to settle the land, they found the church, much as he had, its roof half gone, its pews crumbled, its altar still intact. They cleaned what they could and rededicated it, though none could shake the feeling that someone was already there, waiting. And when they rang the new bell for the first time, it sounded different, deeper, sadder, as though it remembered every name ever spoken beneath its roof. By the spring of 1354, the survivors had begun to believe the nightmare had passed. Markets reopened, children were born, the faint hum of life returned to England's hollowed towns. Bells rang again, not for mourning this time, but for weddings and baptisms, timid celebrations of a world that dared to start over. Men repaired the roads, women restitched the torn banners of their guilds. The air, washed by rain and time, smelled clean again. For the first time in years, laughter drifted down the lanes. But beneath that fragile peace, the pestilence still slept, not gone, only waiting. In Bristol, ships began to arrive once more, their sails patched and their crews gaunt from months at sea. Trade was the city's lifeblood, and desperation had opened its gates wide. Spices, cloth, salt, and iron were unloaded by the cartful. No one noticed the rats, not at first. They scurried through the cargo, black and fat from the voyage, their fleas restless under the heat. A dockworker named Hugh was the first to fall. He complained of chills, then of a swelling beneath his arm that burned like fire. By the second night, his skin had turned ashen, his breath short. He died with a prayer half formed on his lips. His wife buried him quickly, whispering that it was the fever of the sea, nothing more. But 2 days later, she joined him. Then their children, then their neighbors. The bells rang again. In London, the news came slowly, a rumor first, then a trickle of messengers. The plague had returned. Some said it had never left, that it had lingered in the walls, in the rats, in the breath of those who thought themselves spared. Whatever its origin, its fury was the same. Entire streets closed overnight. The carts rolled again through Cheapside. The priests who had survived the first pest now refused to enter the homes of the dying. God has turned his face, they said, and barred the church doors. In the countryside, panic took new shapes. Families fled into the woods, hiding in barns and caves. Some burned their homes behind them, believing the smoke might keep the sickness from following. In one village near Lincoln, the people built a wall of stone around their fields, sealing themselves inside. For weeks, no one saw them. When travelers returned months later, they found the gates open, the cottages silent, and the wells full of bodies. Even the king's physicians could offer nothing new. They spoke again of corrupted air, of humours and celestial misalignments, but their charts and theories had all turned to ash. The rich fled to their estates, the poor died where they stood, and yet, for all its terror, the second plague met a people who no longer screamed. They wept, they prayed, they endured, but the shock was gone. Death had become an old neighbour, returning as expected. When the smoke cleared once more, fewer fell than before. The pest had burned itself weaker, or perhaps the living stronger, but the memory of its return left the survivors hollow once again. They began to understand that what they feared was not merely the sickness, but its permanence, the truth that it would never be gone, not entirely. For even as the graves filled and grass grew back, the people still glanced over their shoulders at every cough, every chill, and in their hearts they carried a knowledge older than faith, that death, once invited, never truly leaves the table. When the second wave passed, England did not rejoice. It exhaled shallowly, distrustfully, as though afraid that even the act of breathing might summon death again. The air felt different now, touched by memory. Every cough, every sudden fever, every sound of a shovel striking earth sent shivers through those who had endured. The people had learned to live, but they had forgotten how to feel safe. Fear became the inheritance of the living. It was not loud or violent. It was quiet, constant, patient. It crept into dreams, into songs, into the way mothers touched their children's faces as if afraid to love them too much. Babies born after the pestilence were whispered to more than they were sung to, as if music itself might wake something sleeping in the air. In Norwich, a teacher named Father Aldred reopened his small school beside the cathedral ruins. Only 6 children came, thin, solemn creatures who rarely smiled. They studied their letters by the light of the broken windows, their voices subdued, their laughter cautious. When one sneezed, the others fell silent, waiting. Aldred told them tales of saints and kings, but they liked best the stories of what the world had been before, when the streets had been crowded and the bells never stopped ringing. "Is it true?" one boy asked. That people used to touch hands in greeting? The priest smiled faintly. Aye, he said, and think nothing of it. At night, Aldred sat alone by the empty pews of the church, staring at the faded murals. The saints looked back with hollow eyes, their paint flaked by damp and time. He had once believed that faith could soothe the world's fear, but now he saw that even faith had learned to tremble. The plague had not destroyed the church. It had hollowed it out, leaving only the shell of ritual. People still prayed, but no longer expected to be answered. In the villages, superstition filled the space where certainty had died. Charms of bone and copper hung above every door. Women burned herbs not for scent, but protection. Men refused to bury their dead under church roofs, fearing the sickness still clung to stone. The sick were left in barns, tended by strangers who wore masks of linen soaked in wine. A new kind of silence settled over the land, not the emptiness of death, but the hush of survival. Farmers spoke little in the fields, merchants avoided eye contact at market, even weddings were quiet affairs. The vows whispered rather than declared. Joy had become a fragile thing, something not to be flaunted for fear that God might notice and take it away. One night in York, a midwife named Agnes delivered a child under the light of a single candle. When the infant drew its first breath, the mother began to sob. "He'll live," Agnes said softly. The woman shook her head. "No," she whispered, "he'll remember." And she was right. The children born after the plague carried that memory, not in their minds but in their eyes. Marrow, a bone-deep wariness of closeness, of trust, of life's suddenness. It was not the sickness that haunted England now, but its echo. Fear had become a new contagion, invisible, inherited, and impossible to bury. Even centuries later, when the world would bustle again and the bells would ring freely, that fear would remain quiet as dust, waiting in the corners of old churches, in the pause between breaths, in the cold touch of a memory that never entirely died. In the years that followed, parchment grew cheap, but words grew scarce. The clerks and record-keepers who had once filled whole volumes with births, debts, marriages, and trades now sat before half-empty books, their quills scratching hesitantly at the margins. Whole families had disappeared, entire villages wiped clean from the rolls. It was as if the kingdom itself had lost the memory of who it was. At Westminster, in the stone hall where the king's chancery once buzzed with scribes, the long desks stood mostly vacant. A few thin men in threadbare robes worked by the narrow light of the windows, copying names from faded documents, trying to make sense of what remained. The air smelled of dust and mould, of ink that had dried too soon. Among them was a clerk named Thomas Eliot, a man who had once been a scholar of law before the pestilence made scholars obsolete. He had survived through chance and solitude, and now, like a monk among ruins, he spent his days repairing the kingdom's memory. His orders were simple: record what endures. But when he opened the parish rolls sent from across England, he found more gaps than ink. One ledger from Kent listed 37 births, then abruptly stopped mid-sentence, the clerk's hand frozen in the loop of a letter. A book from York recorded an entire convent, then, in another's handwriting, the words, "All gone, Lord preserve us." From Wiltshire came only a single page, blackened by smoke. Thomas copied what he could, line after careful line, but the repetition began to haunt him. The names blurred together until they lost their meaning. Alice, John, Robert, Agnes, words of breath on a page for people who no longer breathed. Sometimes he caught himself whispering them aloud, as if the sound might call the dead back to claim their letters. One night, while the candles guttered low, he found a bundle of papers that had fallen behind a chest. They were accounts from London, dated 1348. The ink had faded to brown, the corners gnawed by rats. He smoothed the top sheet and read the heading, "Tithes collected for the feast of Street Michael." There were columns for bread, for oil, for ale, all tallied neatly until the final entry. No feast held. The city is ash. Beneath it, the writer had drawn a small cross, then written only 2 words, We tried. Thomas sat staring at the page until dawn. The next morning, he took a fresh parchment and began a new ledger. At the top he wrote not births nor deaths nor accounts. He wrote the year of forgetting, and beneath it he filled the columns with what he saw each day: the empty streets, the fields grown over, the sound of hammers rebuilding walls where no one yet lived. By the time winter came, the king's chancery closed again, its clerks sent home for want of work. Thomas left the ledgers stacked neatly in the archive vault, their pages blank beyond the halfway point. He did not lock the door. Years later, when the next generation of scribes reopened those rooms, they found his work untouched ink, still dark, parchment still pliant. On the final page, written in a smaller, unsteady hand, were the words, "If no one remembers us, may the silence at least be kind." And then, nothing, only the smell of ink, faint and sweet, lingering like breath in an empty hall. For years after the sickness had waned, the sound of bells was the measure of England's pulse. They tolled for birth and death, feast and famine, war and peace. They reminded the people that time still moved, that the world still breathed. Each village had its own rhythm, a slow, solemn peal for the departed, a bright ringing for harvest, a steady hum for the hours of prayer. The bells were the country's heartbeat, echoing across valleys and moors, over the ruins and the new green that had risen among them. But by the spring of 1353, that heartbeat began to falter. In the city of London, the bell ropes had frayed from overuse. The ringers themselves were old men now, stooped and trembling, survivors who had never recovered their strength. Every day they climbed the narrow staircases to the belfries, their hands blistered from pulling the same cords that had rung death through the plague years. The bells were cracked in places where heat and cold had warped the metal, their notes no longer pure, but rough and weary, like voices hoarse from too much weeping. On a morning in March, the great bell of St. Paul's cracked down its side. It rang once, twice, then broke mid-tone, a sound like thunder folding in on itself. People in the market square below froze. The ringing ceased, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence that rolled outward through the city like fog. At first, smaller bells still answered the chimes from parish towers, the handbells of priests marking the hours. But one by one, their voices fell silent too. Some ropes snapped from age, others were cut by cautious hands, as if the people feared to wake the dead with too much noise. By midsummer, London's skyline stood mute. The silence spread to the countryside. In Canterbury, a young curate climbed the tower of his church to ring the Angelus. As he pulled the cord, the bell swayed once, shuddered, and then froze. The rope snapped, whipping against his shoulder. When he looked up, he saw a bird's nest tucked inside the hollow of the bell, its fledglings sleeping. He left them undisturbed and descended without finishing his duty. By year's end, no bells rang anywhere in England. The sound had vanished so completely that people began to dream of it. They said that at night, in the hours before dawn, they could hear faint echoes from the clouds, ghostly chimes, marking the passing of unseen souls. In that silence, time itself seemed to hesitate. Without the bells, the days blurred together. The old could not tell the hour, and the young forgot the rhythm of prayer. The churches felt heavier, their stone colder. Only the wind moved, sweeping through the towers, rattling the empty ropes against their beams like bones. One evening, an aging bell ringer named Gerard climbed alone into the tower of St. Dunstan's. He had been a boy when the plague first came, and all his life he had measured it by sound, the bells that tolled for the lost, the weddings that never followed. Now, as twilight deepened, he struck the bell with a hammer, once, just to remember. The tone that rang out was low, fractured, imperfect, yet it lingered, trembling in the air, until it melted into dusk. He listened for an echo that did not come, then smiled. "Rest," he whispered. "You've done enough." When morning came, the bell was still. The ropes hung slack, and though life would one day return to the cities and the farms, no one ever rang that bell again. They said later that it was mercy that even the iron had grown tired of mourning. When the last bell fell quiet, England entered a stillness so complete that it seemed the world had forgotten how to make sound. The pestilence was over, the fever had passed, yet the hush it left behind was heavier than grief. It settled over towns and fields alike, in the hollows of ruined abbeys, in the rafters of half-burned homes, in the furrows where new wheat pushed through soil that had known too many graves. The silence was not absence, it was memory. The survivors lived inside it carefully, as if afraid to break it. They spoke in low voices, walked softly on the roads, and paused before churches whose doors stood open to the wind. The world had not died, but it had changed its shape. What had once been full of sound laughter, haggling, the clatter of carts now carried only the murmur of wind through grass and the slow creak of timbers settling in the sun. It was as though England itself had drawn a long breath and forgotten to let it go. In York, a monk named Brother Henry returned to his ruined priory to rebuild what he could. Alone, he cleared the courtyard of weeds and swept the dust from the chapel floor. When he finally rang the small handbell that had survived the years of plague, the note startled even him. It echoed down the empty cloisters, startling birds from the rafters, before fading into the grey sky. "Too loud," he murmured, and set it aside. From then on, he prayed in silence. Across the countryside, the land began to heal in slow, patient ways. Forests crept into the spaces where villages had been. Rivers ran clearer than anyone remembered. The deer, once hunted for sport, wandered through the churchyards without fear. Nature had reclaimed what humanity had abandoned, not in vengeance, but in indifference. The world continued quieter, simpler, stripped of its noise and pride. Those who survived lived differently now. They planted not to profit, but to endure. They married not in splendor, but in solemn gratitude. They measured time not by bells, but by light, the way morning spilled across the fields, the way twilight folded the earth into shadow. Children born after the plague learned from their parents' whispers rather than their songs. They grew up knowing that joy could vanish overnight, that even laughter should be spoken softly so as not to wake what still lingered in the dark. Years later, when travelers crossed the countryside, they spoke of England as if it were a dream, a land too quiet, too beautiful, too haunted to be real. In the ruins of cities, they found carvings of angels with broken wings and altars overgrown with ivy. They found letters buried beneath floorboards, prayers scrawled on scraps of linen, names etched into door frames that opened onto empty rooms. Everywhere, traces of the living clung to the bones of the dead, but there were moments brief, tender, almost holy when the silence broke. The sound of a child's laughter in a field, the crackle of a D-stee, fire in a rebuilt hearth, the toll of a single bell, timid but whole, rising into the cold evening air. It did not ring for death that time. It rang for the living, for those who had walked through the valley of unending loss and come out the other side, for a world that would never again be the same, but which still, somehow, found the strength to begin again. And when that bell's echo faded into the wind, it left behind not fear, but peace, fragile, hard-earned, and eternal, the silence after the storm.